In March, the bait ran. That was how the harbor talked about it. Not the fish arrived or the capelin spawned or the forage fish came inshore. The bait ran. It was a verb that contained everything. The movement to the tidal creek, the concentration in the warmer shallows before the offshore push, the particular quality of March mornings when the water in the creek changed color, a specific greenish cast in the shallows, visible from the bank in the right angle of early light. And the birds worked the surface in a way that told anyone watching that something was happening underneath. Elsa Vance had been running the fuel dock and bait operation at Sulak Harbor for 34 years. She had watched the bait run every March for 34 years. She had sold bait, capelin, small herring, sand lance, out of the live wells and holding tanks at the dock's far end, and she had maintained the daily availability log that her grandmother had started in 1948, when the bait operation had been the only thing keeping commercial boats fueled and funded to the early spring weeks before the main salmon season opened. The availability log was in a wooden box behind the fuel dock counter. Plain pine, the corners worn soft, no lock, not organized by year, organized by month, and within month by species. The way you organize information when the point was to know what was available on a given day and not to reconstruct a 75-year history. The daily entries were brief. March 4th, capelin running strong, sand lance appearing, 12 boats out. March 11th, herring in, bait plentiful, 18 boats. The record wasn't elegant. It was functional. Elsa's grandmother had started it because the harbor master had asked her to. He had needed to know, each morning of the March staging weeks, whether to tell incoming boats to come to the bait dock or to wait another day. The log had been the answer to that question, written down, so the answer persisted past the phone call that asked it. That was its entire origin, a practical record kept in service of a practical need. It was also, Elsa had gradually understood over the years, the only document that captured what the tidal creek did in March. The creek itself was not notable. It ran about 1.5 miles through the coastal flats before entering the harbor, and it was shallow enough that you could wade it in knee-high rubber boots at low tide. What made it significant was its thermal characteristics. In March, the creek ran warmer than the adjacent ocean by several degrees, warmed by the coastal flats it crossed, by the black sediment that absorbed heat during the brief but increasingly direct March sun, by the particular orientation that let afternoon warmth accumulate in the shallows before the tidal exchange moved it out again. Forage fish found this warmth before they moved offshore. Not all forage fish. The cold water specialists didn't come inshore this early. But the capelin and the sand lance and some of the smaller herring cohorts used the creek's thermal signature as a staging area, concentrating there for 2 to 3 weeks before the offshore push began. Elsa's grandmother had first documented this in the 1948 log, and the pattern had repeated every year since. The harbor had been built around this pattern. The early commercial fishing season opened in April, depending on boats being provisioned with bait during the March concentration. No March bait run meant no early season. No early season meant a significant revenue gap for an isolated community with limited economic alternatives. The bait log had been kept since 1948 because the harbor master needed to know, on any given March day, whether bait was available and in what quantity. The entries existed to answer a practical daily question, not to build an environmental record. But 75 years of daily practical answers turned out to be an environmental record, not because anyone had intended it that way, not because anyone had been thinking about the creek's thermal characteristics or the forage fish's staging behavior or what any of this meant in terms of habitat. They had been thinking about whether the boats could go out tomorrow. They had written down what they found when they went to look. That was the record. 75 years of going to look and writing down what was there. The offshore wind energy project had been in federal permitting for 2 years before Elsa attended her first formal consultation. She had followed the project in the regional energy newsletter and through her contacts in the harbor community, and she had attended the early informational meetings without comment, the way she attended most institutional events, to listen, to form her own understanding of what was being proposed, and to wait until she had something specific enough to say to justify saying it. The project was large, a major offshore array, designed to serve the regional grid, with a submarine cable connecting the offshore generation to the mainland through a coastal routing that included her harbor's tidal creek. The cable will be trenched through the creek bed in winter, before the March bait season, using mechanical equipment that would disturb the bottom sediment along approximately a mile of the creek's lower reach. She had read the project documents carefully, not because she was looking for something specific, but because she had learned over 34 years of running a harbor operation that you needed to understand what was being proposed before you could understand what it would affect. She had read the marine biology section twice. She had noted that the marine biology section characterized the creek as a low-diversity shallow coastal waterway with seasonal use by small forage species, and that the cable installation was designed to minimize bottom disturbance. The installation window was specified as January-February to avoid impacts to documented marine mammal and seabird activity in the adjacent bay. She had set down the document and looked at the wooden box. January-February installation, sediment disturbance in the creek bottom, tidal exchange carrying the disturbed sediment through the system. She had looked at the March entries in the bait log. She raised it at the formal consultation session in October, with copies of 3 years of March log entries and a summary she had written at her kitchen table over 2 evenings. The summary was not a scientific document. She was not a scientist. It was a description of what the log showed and what she believed would happen, written in the plain terms of a person who had been watching a tidal creek for 34 years and had a specific concern about what was going to be done to its bottom. She said, "The tidal creek your cable route passes through is the primary staging area for the forage fish that sustained this harbor's early commercial season. The staging depends on the creek's thermal characteristics in March, specifically on the warmer water that develops in the shallows due to the creek's floor composition and orientation. I have 75 years of daily bait availability records showing that the staging occurs every March without interruption. Your installation disturbs a creek bed in January and February. Disturbed sediment changes the thermal properties of shallow water. I believe the March staging will be compromised." The Wind Company's marine biologist, a careful man named Dr. Anand, listened respectfully. He said the creek had been assessed as low-diversity coastal habitat with seasonal use by small forage species. He said forage fish populations were resilient to temporary substrate disturbance and would return to suitable habitat following installation. He said the installation's environmental review had determined that the impacts were temporary and acceptable. Elsa said, "The impacts are not temporary for us. The March staging is a foundation of our early season. If it fails, the boats don't go out. If the boats don't go out, this harbor has no revenue from April through June. One failed staging season is 3 months of lost income for every boat that works out of here." Dr. Anand said he understood the concern and would note it in the consultation record. He said, "Forage fish populations are highly mobile and resilient. The staging behavior would resume in subsequent seasons once the creek substrate restabilized." Elsa said, "If the staging fails this March, there may not be a harbor operating for subsequent seasons." Dr. Anand wrote something in his notes. Nobody else in the room said anything for a moment. She received a written response 6 weeks later confirming that the consultation concern had been reviewed and the installation timeline had been determined to be appropriate. She had been wrong about one thing, and she knew it. When she had first connected the cable installation to the March staging, her initial concern had been water temperature, that the installation work would happen in January, and January was still cold, and she had worried that the installation vessels or the trenching equipment might introduce silt plumes that would reduce solar heating absorption in the creek's shallows and suppress the thermal development that drove the staging. She had spent 3 weeks on this theory, reviewing the log for evidence of previous thermal suppression events in March. She found several years of reduced concentration that she could plausibly attribute to regional cold anomalies, years when the ocean was colder than usual and the creek's warming was less pronounced. In those years, the log showed reduced staging, delayed timing, or both. This was consistent with her temperature theory. If the water stayed cold, the staging was weaker. She had been convinced enough to nearly submit the consultation comment in that form. She had sat down to write it out before something felt insufficiently specific. She mentioned concern to a harbor engineer she trusted, expecting confirmation. The engineer redirected her entirely. The engineer had pointed out that the real thermal risk wasn't from the installation's direct temperature effects, which would be minimal in January. The risk was from the substrate change itself. The creek's warming depended on the black organic sediment in the shallows absorbing solar radiation. Mechanical trenching through the creek bed would displace that sediment, replacing it or mixing it with the subgrade material below, which was gravel and sand with a much lower heat absorption coefficient. The thermal signature of the creek's shallows would be different after the trenching, not immediately, not dramatically, but measurably, in a way that might affect the forage fish's detection of the thermal gradient that drew them to the creek in the first place. This was a more specific and more defensible concern than her original one. She had spent several evenings revising the written summary to reflect the engineer's explanation, reading the relevant sections of the project's environmental review to check whether substrate thermal properties had been assessed. They had not been. The review's assessment of thermal impacts was limited to the installation equipment's direct thermal footprint, not the substrate level change in solar absorption that the trenching would create. She submitted the revised summary before the formal consultation. The consultation record contained the revised version. The installation proceeded in February. In the first week of March, Elsa walked the creek bank in the morning the way she walked it every March, from the harbor entrance up to the mid-creek bend where the capelin usually appeared first, where the water got that particular color change she had been reading since her grandmother showed her what it meant. The color change was not there. She walked up to the upper reach where the sand lance usually showed in the first weeks. Not there either. She walked the whole creek, the mile and a half of it, and came back to the harbor with nothing. She opened the log and wrote, March 7th, bait absent. Creek showing no forage fish concentration. Installation complete February 15th. She walked the creek every day that week. The log recorded, March 8th, absent. March 9th, absent. March 10th, trace. Single small school of herring at the upper reach, not in the shallows, not staging. March 11th, absent again. The harbor was quiet in a way it had not been quiet in March in 34 years. No boats were going out for bait. No boats were getting provisioned. The early commercial season, that was supposed to begin in April, had no foundation under it. She kept the log. There was nothing else to do. This was the hardest part of March she had not expected to experience. The daily walk of the creek that produced nothing. The daily entry that recorded nothing. The accumulation of zeros in a log that had never had a zero before. She kept walking and kept recording because stopping would mean admitting the season was over before it started, and because the log had been kept through thin years and unusual years and years when the run was late, and in all of those years the keeping of the log had been the right thing to do. The boats were tied up. The fuel dock was idle. The commercial season that was supposed to be building toward April had nothing under it. The marine biologist who contacted her in April was a woman named Dr. Petrov, who worked for the state's coastal fisheries program and had been tracking forage fish distribution in this region as part of a long-term monitoring effort. She had noticed an anomaly in her early spring sampling data. The tidal creek outside Sulak Harbor, which had shown reliable forage fish concentrations in her 3 previous years of monitoring, showed essentially none in March. She had found Elsa's consultation comment in the project's federal record. She came to the harbor and spent 2 days reading the bait log. All of it, 75 years of daily March entries. The capelin records, the sand lance records, the herring cohort records, the occasional notations about unusual years and what might have caused them. She came to Elsa at the end of the second day, the log still open on the counter between them. She said, "Your log shows 75 consecutive years of March forage fish staging in this creek. That is an extraordinary record. I have never seen a private data set with this kind of continuity for this kind of habitat use." Elsa said, "It was kept because we needed to know if the bait would run. Nothing more." Dr. Petrov said, "I know. That's what makes it valuable. It was kept for a practical reason, on a daily basis, without any selection bias toward years where interesting things happened. If nothing ran, the entry said nothing ran. That's actually harder to find than deliberately collected scientific data." She said, "The substrate disturbance from a cable installation matches the timing and location of the thermal staging area that your log documents. The mechanism is consistent with what you described in your consultation comment. The forage fish are not using the creek this March because the thermal signature they're responding to has been altered." She asked, Do you know if the staging has ever failed before? Elsa pulled the log and looked. She went back to the March entries, not just her own 34 years, but her grandmother's years before that, back to 1948. She was looking for a year with no entry, or an entry that said 0, or an entry that said the bait had simply not come. She did not find one. In 75 years of March entries, there was no year without at least a partial staging event. Some years were thin. Some years the run was delayed by a week or 10 days. But there was no year with 0. This was the first 0. Dr. Petrov's findings went to the state's Fisheries Management Office and, separately, to the federal agency that had issued the cable installation permit. Her report documented the forage fish staging event, its relationship to the creek's thermal characteristics, the installation's impact on those characteristics, and the correlation between the installation and the first complete failure of the staging event in 75 years of record. She cited the bait log directly, not as supporting evidence, but as the primary baseline. The log was the only document that showed what the creek had been doing in March for 75 years. Nothing else existed. The Wind Company agreed to fund the creek's substrate restoration effort, a program to reintroduce appropriate organic sediment material in the affected sections of the creek's shallow zones, to restore the thermal absorption characteristics that the installation had disrupted. This was not a remediation anyone had anticipated during the permitting process, because the permitting process had not assessed the substrate-level thermal characteristics of the creek's shallow zones. It had assessed a low-diversity coastal waterway with seasonal use by small forage species. The substrate restoration program was a consequence of the gap between those two descriptions. The restoration was funded, designed, and implemented over the following summer and fall. The following March, Elsa walked the creek on the 7th, the same date she had walked it the previous year when she had ridden the first 0. The bait ran, not at the levels of the best years. The substrate restoration was partial, and the creek would take time to fully recover the organic composition that had developed over decades. But the capelin were in the shallows. The sand lands were showing at the upper reach, and by the second week of March, 12 boats had been provisioned and were working. She opened the log and wrote, March 9th, capelin running. First since installation year. Partial. 12 boats out. Watching. She had written those last 2 words, watching, at the end of every anomalous March entry since she had taken over the log from her grandmother 34 years ago. She had adopted the notation from her grandmother without thinking much about it, the way you adopted practices that were already established. Her grandmother had written them too. She noticed, in the thin years and the unusual years, in the year in 1973, when something had happened in the bay that none of them had fully understood, but that the bait log had documented faithfully, reduce, partial, watching. And in 1956, when the run had been 2 weeks late arrival, reduced, watching. And in 1963, when the creek had run unusually clear for reasons no one at the time had explained, clear water, no sand lands, capelin light, watching. The watching had always been there. The watching was what the log was. The creek outside was doing what the creek did in March. The bait was running again, which meant the boats would go out, which meant the harbor would have a season. She closed the log and put it back in the wooden box behind the counter. The box had been behind this counter since 1948. Her grandmother had set it there. Elsa had never moved it. It had been in the same position through 34 seasons of fuel dock operations, through the harbor's best years and its difficult ones, through the years when the March staging was strong and the years when it was thin, and this year when it had not come at all. She supposed whoever ran this dock after her would find it there and continue it or not continue it according to what they needed. The log had survived because keeping it had been useful. It would survive as long as keeping it was useful, which was as long as the creek kept running and the bait kept coming in March, which was as long as someone needed to know if the boats could go out tomorrow. The box had been there for as long as the answer had been needed. She expected it would be there for as long as the question remained.